2 long hours passed. At 14:05 the Nachi plane radioed that the enemy force of 5 cruisers and 10 destroyers was continuing on the same course. With 2 of our cruisers 150 miles to the rear, the enemy fleet was definitely more powerful than our escort. Admiral Takagi ordered the transports to turn northward. I no longer felt the tropical heat. Cold sweat ran down my back. We had blundered into a trap. If the enemy picked up speed immediately, he could easily tear our convoy to shreds and sink the transports like clay pigeons. I shuddered at the prospect. The 2 forces drew steadily closer, and I wondered why the enemy fleet still cruised at a mere 12 knots. At 15:10 Nachi's scout plane radioed an amazing message. The enemy fleet has turned around and is headed towards Surabaya. Admiral Takagi, on Nachi's bridge, laughed. The enemy ships were merely staying clear of our air raids on Surabaya. The enemy is in no shape to fight us. We will stick to our original plans and schedule. The force will turn and head south again. At 16:30 there was another surprise message from the Nachi scout plane. The enemy fleet has turned around again. The double column formation is now shifting to single column. The enemy is gaining speed and is headed on a course of 20 degrees. 10 minutes later, another message came. The enemy speed is 22 knots. It is heading directly for our convoy. There was no longer any doubt about the enemy's intention. I checked the chart and found that the distance to the enemy fleet was 60 miles. If both sides ran at 20 knots, we would meet within an hour and a half. Takagi, suddenly glum and angry, ordered the transports to turn around once again. He also ordered the cruisers to catapult their observation planes, and the escort ships to line up into fighting formation. Cruisers Nachi and Haguro belatedly began to pick up speed. My flotilla quickly formed in a column, cruiser Jintsu followed by the 4 destroyers. The transports turned around and fanned out. Their movement was painfully slow. They were mostly requisitioned merchant ships and their crews were untrained. It was distressing to watch their disarray. Many were baffled at the repeatedly changing orders and they were unable to respond quickly. Most irritating of all was the slow arrival of Nachi and Haguro. They were so many miles to the rear. Each of these 2 heavy cruisers packed a punch equal to that of 10 destroyers. Without them I did not see how we could fight the powerful enemy fleet. If the enemy increased speed to 30 knots they might arrive at any moment. If that happened, what could we do? At 17 the chaos subsided as the transports resumed an orderly formation escorted by patrol ships and minesweepers. Behind our flotilla, 4 other destroyers formed up. The other flotilla, consisting of cruiser Naka and 7 destroyers, brought up the rear. The Japanese warships now speed at 24 knots, ready to fight. I scanned the horizon as we cruised around the 2-mile-long column, but found no trace of our 2 heavy cruisers. I mumbled profanely in my vexation. "Enemy ship," shouted Warrant Officer Shigeru Iwata, who, gifted with amazing eyesight, was the chief spotter on the bridge. I looked where he was pointing. I saw several masts to the south. They soon became visible to everyone on board. From pictures I had studied, the masts were clearly recognizable as belonging to the Dutch cruiser De Ruyter. De Ruyter is distant 28,000 meters, about 20 miles, Iwata chanted. It is closing rapidly. I turned around. Nachi and Haguro were still not in sight. There was, in fact, nothing to be seen but the many Japanese transports, sluggishly fanning out behind us. I shouted, "Gunners and torpedomen, get ready. Our target is the lead cruiser in the enemy column." All noises in my ship were suddenly hushed. We were heading for our first major sea battle. The silence was broken by Iwata's voice, "Commander, look, Nachi and Haguro there." I looked around and saw the long-awaited cruisers on the eastern horizon. They were far away, but could make it. "Good," I nodded. The time was 17:30. The enemy ships suddenly altered course to the west and began running almost parallel to us. This was another puzzling development. The enemy must have seen our column formation. Why did he refuse to go straight ahead? By staying on his original course, the enemy could have chosen broadside targets while keeping himself only thinly exposed to Japanese gunfire. That enemy movement again enabled us to gain time. Admiral Takagi leapt with joy when he saw the enemy, still 36,000 meters distant, swerving to the parallel course. Now I can catch up with our fleet, he yelled. At 1746 Takagi's battle orders were issued. Deploy in 3 columns and head on course 170 degrees. 1 minute later cruiser Naka opened fire at the enemy 22,000 meters away too far for its 14-centimeter guns. Realizing the mix-up, Takagi hurriedly changed his orders. Keep course parallel to the enemy. Cruiser Jintsu and her 4 destroyers swung out and moved some 10,000 meters along the western course of the force. Jintsu fired its 6 14-centimeter guns at De Ruyter, 18,000 meters away. The shells were wasted. The 4 destroyers watched glumly. At that distance, their 12.7-centimeter guns were also useless. Nachi and Haguro started shooting their 20-centimeter guns from a distance of 25,000 meters. Their shells were equally ineffective. The Allied fleet swerved again gradually to the southwest, increasing the distance from our ships. The enemy guns were now blazing, but the distance was also too great for them. All their shells were wasted. At 1805 Rear Admiral Shoji Nishimura, commanding Destroyer Squadron 4, apparently lost patience with the ineffective gun duel over a widening distance. Nishimura's cruiser Naka and his 7 destroyers released 43 torpedoes at the enemy, then estimated to be more than 15,000 meters distant. The oxygen torpedoes, pride of the Imperial Navy, could run 40,000 meters at a speed of 36 knots. But released at such a distance, even they could not be expected to hit moving targets except by sheer chance. Of these torpedoes, a dozen or so blew up after running a few thousand meters. There is no explanation of why they exploded. It may have been a mechanical failure, or perhaps some of them collided and their explosions induced the others to explode. The other torpedoes went on, but hit nothing. They, too, were wasted. Allied officers must have been astounded at the range and spread of these torpedoes. It must have been quite nerve-wracking. After the torpedo attack, the Allied fleet turned sharply to the south. At 1827 8 Allied planes appeared. They flew on some 20 miles ahead of us and headed for our transports. About a dozen Zero fighters, which had been called in from Balikpapan at the time our escort ships had deserted the convoy, gleefully pounced on the enemy bombers. All of the enemy planes were shot down before they released any bombs at the Japanese transports. This attempted enemy air attack was yet another puzzling development of the day. It was cloudy with a lowering sun piercing the clouds from time to time. But dusk was fast approaching, and sunset would be at 1950. By 1833 Admiral Takagi determined that we were merely wasting ammunition, and the possibility was growing that the enemy might flee under the dark of night if we continued the battle in that fashion. He ordered all ships to close and charge the enemy. The enemy fleet had again turned to starboard and was now heading due west. The Japanese ships also turned to the west, with guns blazing. 4 minutes later, British cruiser Exeter was afire, causing sudden confusion in the enemy formation. The enemy ships promptly emitted thick smoke screens. It was later learned that a 20-centimeter shell, from Nachi or Haguro, had hit Exeter's powder magazine. Exeter, in second position in the Allied column, lost speed rapidly. In slowing she swung to the left out of column, and barely avoided collision with following American cruiser Houston. An amazing development followed when Houston also swerved to the left, and all the following ships did the same. Flagship De Ruyter alone continued straight ahead, and it was a few minutes before she discovered that the rest of the column had turned off. In turning around to rejoin them at full speed, she almost collided with a destroyer. This sudden chaos in the Allied formation enabled us to close, and 8 Japanese destroyers, including mine, went dashing in at 30 knots. The Allied fleet reformed, leaving the limping Exeter behind, and the guns of every ship were leveled directly at us. At 7,000 meters from the enemy fleet, destroyer Tokatsukaze, a little ahead of Amatsukaze, took a shell hit. Amatsukaze was enveloped by thick white smoke bursting from Tokatsukaze, which blinded us. Shells rained all around, raising water pillars on every side, but still none reached my ship. I gritted my teeth and made a dogged dash as the enemy shells came closer and closer. I had to continue if I was to release my torpedoes effectively. The enemy was heading northwest, directly toward us, in his first aggressive operation of the day. 6,000 meters to the enemy now. Sweat streamed down my face as I grasped the bridge railing. Not yet. Wait. We must close to at least 5,000 meters. Enemy shells were falling close, and could hit my ship at any moment. At 1927 Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka ordered his cruiser to release 8 torpedoes. When Jintz's fish swished out of their tubes, I could hardly restrain an order for gunfire. A near miss dashed water on my face. My knees shook and my arms trembled at the time. I grow quite uncomfortable when I think of it even now. I was not worried about being a coward, but was concerned that my cool judgment might vanish, being under the fire of enemy ships for the first time. I saw 16 more torpedoes spring into the water from Yukikaze and Tokutsukaze. At this I gave in and yelled, "Fire torpedoes!" 4 other destroyers followed Amatsukaze's lead. I calculated the chances of a hit. Very slim at 6,000 meters. Perhaps less than 5%, 3 hits out of the 72 I figured. How wrong this proved to be. The enemy fleet made a rapid turn to the west, and I saw that at least half of our torpedoes would pass beyond the enemy bows. The rest of the fish reached the area of the targets but all seemed to have missed, when suddenly there was a tremendous flash. Dutch destroyer Kortenaar was hit and sank instantly. 1 hit out of 64 shots. What poor aiming, and how excellent were the enemy's evasion tactics. Rear Admiral Shoji Nishimura's cruiser Naka and his 7 destroyers arrived presently and also released 64 torpedoes. The enemy again swung 90 degrees, this time to the north, in an unorthodox, fantastic movement, and all 64 of these torpedoes were wasted. The enemy then took 2 more 90-degree turns and the whole column turned around in a thick smokescreen. Such tactics were not to be found in the Imperial Navy manual. I just stood and gaped. An enemy shell hit destroyer Asagumo, killing 5 and wounding 19, disabling its engine for a time. After the torpedo release, our 2nd Squadron and Naka's 4th Squadron drew their courses in looping curves and turned in a complex movement. The distance to the enemy fleet was steadily expanding. Our chances appeared to be lost. However, Allied behavior on this night was really inscrutable. After having made a 360-degree turn, the enemy had apparently turned heel and run under the thick smoke screens. But the Allied fleet then made 2 more rapid 90-degree turns and headed back straight to the north. The enemy intention remains a mystery. Perhaps they still wanted to make a drive against the Japanese convoy. Japanese cruisers Nachi and Haguro, trailing far behind the 2 destroyer squadrons, saw the enemy and turned around. At about 2,000 hours they released 16 torpedoes at a range of 16,000 meters. The distance was too great. The Allied fleet again made a 360-degree turn, and all these torpedoes were also wasted. The enemy fleet speed at full steam southward toward Surabaya. The Japanese cruisers would not chase. The staff officers uneasily watched a series of about 12 explosions to the south. They had no idea what the explosions were and suspected that enemy submarines were attacking the Japanese destroyers. It was later ascertained that these explosions were simply their own torpedoes, which had traveled 40,000 meters to the south, hitting the shore. In the gathering darkness we could also see the Surabaya lighthouse, just 20 miles away. At 20:30 hours Takagi ordered all ships to break off pursuit and gather near the transports. The battle was indeed a series of blunders made by each side. Almost every man in Tanaka's destroyer squadron 2 was disgruntled at the order to break off action. Our ships had not expended as much ammunition as the others, and I also felt that we had forfeited a chance of giving hot pursuit and finishing off the enemy. When Takagi saw that all the destroyers were turning to the north, he ordered Nachi and Haguro to halt and pick up the 5 scout planes catapulted from these cruisers earlier. Takagi almost paid with his life as a result of this decision. Only a serious blunder by the enemy saved him. It was technically difficult to pick up the planes ditching near the vessels. Later in the war many Japanese warships simply gave up their planes once they were catapulted. At that time, however, while Japan was winning, commanders were eager to recover catapulted planes. So Takagi was quite right in his decision to recover his flyers. He was entirely wrong, however, in thinking that the Allied fleet had fled to Surabaya. At 20:50 Nachi was trying to pick up the last of the 5 planes, when a lookout called, "Battleship Division 3 has arrived." Commander Ishikawa looked through his binoculars. 3-masted ships, he mumbled. Yes, they look like Haruna and Kirishima. How did they get here? They were in the Indian Ocean just 2 days ago, the information officer remarked incredulously on the bridge of Nachi. 30 seconds later, Ishikawa screamed in rage, "Damn! Those are enemy ships, and 4 of them are heading toward us. They are only 12,000 meters away." There was furor and commotion everywhere in the ship. The 2 cruisers were stopped dead. How could ships fight when they were dead in the water? And the crews were not at battle stations. A dozen flares were fired by the oncoming enemy. Admiral Takagi bit his lip so hard that he drew blood. He was in agony. "Hurry up the plane recovery," he ordered. "All men to battle stations." Spines tingled. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 3 minutes. "The plane is caught," yelled the winchman. Takagi roared. "Engine, full astern." Nachi's engines shuddered to life. The ship slowly began to move backward, a plane dangling at its side by the winch cable. The enemy cruisers opened fire and near misses began dropping all around. Takagi ordered smoke as Nachi and Haguro got up to 18 knots, the minimum fighting speed. Both ships turned and opened fire but, knowing they were outnumbered, did not use searchlights. The ensuing gun duel, conducted at a distance of 12,000 meters, merely wasted ammunition on both sides. After 10 minutes, Nachi and Haguro lost sight of the opposing ships, and the crisis was over. But a new anxiety arose. Takagi said, "The enemy may be headed for our transports." The 2 cruisers went to 30 knots in frantic search for the enemy ships which 20 minutes earlier had given them such a scare. Takagi ordered cruiser Jintsu, some 5,000 meters away, to catapult its remaining plane and scout for the enemy. Admiral Tanaka responded quickly. At 21:45 the Jintsu plane radioed. An enemy force of 4 cruisers and 6 destroyers is heading south. This news relieved the harried officers in Nachi and Haguro. Evidently our 2 cruisers had encountered the enemy as he was making the last 90-degree turn of a 180-degree movement. The Allies had not expected to meet the Japanese in that fashion, and had pursued their planned course to the south. They thereby lost an excellent chance to maul our forces. Had they rushed in for a showdown, they could at least have crippled Nachi and Haguro and might have then massacred the unguarded transports. The enemy naval force had taken a beating. Burning Exeter headed for Surabaya. 3 destroyers were sunk. 6 other destroyers, badly damaged, had also cleared the area. The remaining Allied ships regrouped close to the Java coast. There were 4 cruisers De Ruyter, Houston, Perth and Java and 2 destroyers which assembled in a series of their familiar turns. They valiantly decided to head north in another attempt to challenge the Japanese. Unfortunately, they had already missed their best chance. The force made one 90-degree turn, then another. British destroyer Jupiter hit an Allied mine and sank instantly. The 5 other ships did not retreat. They made one more turn, of 45 degrees, to head straight north, illumined from time to time by flares dropped from the Jintsu plane. The moon was bright, but frequent rain squalls reduced visibility. The Allies headed for their final bid, driving through the darkness which was punctuated by Japanese flares. Japanese warships were also being reformed and readied for a night action. Only a few had been hit, none sunk. All were in fighting shape, eager for a scrap. Heavy cruisers Nachi and Haguro kept watch to the north in accordance with steady reports from the Jintsu scout plane. At 33 minutes past midnight on February 28 there was a flurry on the bridge of Nachi as it appeared that the enemy was heading doggedly to the north. Nachi and Haguro immediately swung northward, to parallel the Allied column, and slowed down to achieve a good attack angle. Economy of fuel and ammunition was a matter of great concern to the Japanese ships, so their gunfire was only intermittent. No hits were scored on the enemy ships. Some Allied accounts published after the war say the Allied fleet at the time knew nothing about the approaching Japanese ships. Nachi, however, reports that there was return fire but that it was ineffective. At 12:53 Nachi released 8 torpedoes and Haguro 4 at targets bearing 60 degrees to starboard. The enemy ships were 10,000 meters distant. Encountering a brief rain squall, the Japanese officers crossed their fingers and hoped. At 1:06 the dark night was suddenly lit by a tremendous fire pillar to the southeast. A torpedo had hit cruiser Java A midship. 4 minutes later there was another explosion in the Allied column, and De Ruyter burst into flames to burn like a matchbox. Sailors on the decks of Nachi and Haguro shouted banzai. They leapt and danced and slapped each other on the back with joy. Admiral Takagi spoke coolly. "Let's finish off the remaining ships." Nachi and Haguro rushed northeast at full speed through little rain squalls. Failing to locate any other ships, they swung near the two burning ships. "Don't waste ammunition on them," Takagi said. "They are done for." The search was called off at 3. The last puzzle of the day was the movement of the American cruiser Houston and Australian cruiser Perth. And Takagi's fruitless search to the north was probably the last Japanese mistake of the battle. The other two Allied ships had turned around as soon as Java and De Ruyter burst into flames. They moved southwest, following the coast, a curious finale to their defiant northward sortie. 9 minutes past midnight on March 1, destroyer Fubuki spotted two unidentified ships. They were located some 10,000 meters east of Bobby Island, near Banten Bay, roughly 500 nautical miles from the scene of the Java Sea Battle. Commander Yasuo Yamashita, Fubuki's skipper, had no idea what these ships were. Fubuki swung around and followed some 8,000 meters behind the two mysterious ships. The ships were Houston and Perth, and the mystery is how they ever made the 24-hour voyage without being observed during the day by Japanese scout planes. After the long hours of fighting in the running battle of the Java Sea, these ships were low in ammunition. They had made a 500-mile voyage at some 20 knots and were also running low on fuel. They were in no shape to strike back at a vastly superior Japanese force. The two ships, headed for fuel and ammunition supplies, must have been astounded to sight a 56-ship Japanese convoy in Banten Bay, ready for landing. They bravely started to shell these transports at 37 minutes past midnight. Japanese destroyer Harukaze dashed forward to lay smokescreens. Destroyer Fubuki fired 9 torpedoes. Rear Admiral Akisaburo Hara's 12 escorting warships scrambled in confusion and chaos. Fubuki had notified them of two mysterious ships entering the bay, but they were still not fully prepared for a battle. There were just too many opposing the two Allied ships. Some of the skippers told me later they were busy the whole time evading friendly shells and torpedoes. Within an hour, however, both Allied ships were sunk. 3 Japanese transports were badly damaged, and 1 the troop command ship was sunk. General Hitoshi Imamura, the top army commander, was thrown into the sea and had to swim to shore. Japanese casualties were extremely light. An investigation committee studied this confused battle but produced no solution as to how the Japanese transports were sunk. There were opinions that the transports had been hit by Fubuki's torpedoes, which were fired from a distance of 7,000 meters. But other Japanese ships had released at longer ranges. While all the transports completed their landing successfully near Surabaya, cruisers Nachi and Haguro were busy. They contacted another group of 3 remaining enemy ships about noon the same day near Bowen Island to the north. The 2 Japanese ships, reinforced by cruisers Ashigara and Myoko, sank the limping British cruiser Exeter at 13:30. British destroyer Encounter was sunk 10 minutes later, and U.S. destroyer Pope was finished off at 15:30. Only 4 American destroyers managed to flee from Bali Strait to the south. 4 others were sunk by Japanese planes from the Nagumo Task Force. Not a single transport or warship was lost in the convoy headed by Takagi. He achieved his purpose with complete success, and the battle ended in a lopsided Japanese victory. Nevertheless, Takagi was furiously attacked for his series of blunders. He was particularly criticized for having opened fire at a range of 28,000 meters, and wasting ammunition. When the battle ended, Nachi, for instance, had only 7 shells left for each of its 10 20-centimeter guns. Tanaka's Jintsu had practically no fuel and was almost adrift. Gunnery officers scorned Takagi, saying, "He is a submariner, and does not know how to use guns." Takagi and his aide, Nagasawa, offered no excuses. Takagi was soon transferred to command of a submarine fleet. Nagasawa returned to Tokyo and was assigned to the Personnel Bureau. This action taught many lessons. After my ship's first encounter and release of torpedoes, we remained outside the main scene of battle. But I observed much of the action and saw the fire pillars of Java and De Ruyter from a distance. This one battle meant more to me than all the hundreds of practice maneuvers in which I had participated. Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka ordered my destroyer to Banjarmasin for refueling in the afternoon of February 28, when he had determined that the waters near Surabaya were clear of all hostile surface ships. I was to escort the Dutch hospital ship we had halted before the battle opened, taking it to the nearest Japanese base in Borneo. Be sure to take on a maximum load of fuel on your way back, Tanaka cautioned, because our other ships will have to refuel from you. Our flotilla had joined the operation from Timor and was badly short of fuel. My ship Amatsukaze barely had fuel to reach Banjarmasin at the economical speed of 18 knots. Tanaka was properly doubtful that any of the other ships could have made it. Passing Bawan Island, we sighted men in the water. Coming closer we found that there were some 100 Caucasians, apparently from Allied ships sunk in the midnight encounter. Hands raised in appeal for help, they cried, "Water, water." The sight was pitiable. I had no personal hatred for the drowning enemy. But what could I do? My small ship could take 40 or 50 of them, at most. How could I discriminate and pick only half of these survivors? Moreover, my fuel supply was rapidly dwindling. If I should halt the ship braving the chance of attack from possible enemy submarines, it was doubtful if we could make port. I ordered a message sent to Admiral Tanaka. More than 100 enemy survivors adrift 60 miles, 270 degrees from Bawan Island. Urge rescue effort. The navigator took the ship cautiously past the drifting men. One of my lieutenants, who spoke good English, ran to the rail and shouted, hang on, a rescue ship will come soon." We made Banjarmasin with the Dutch hospital ship. After refueling and taking on board all possible oil, we headed back to Surabaya on March 1. Passing Bawan, I looked around but saw none of the Allied survivors. We had had no word of any rescue operation in these waters since the previous day, and I felt very depressed. I reviewed the awkward Battle of the Java Sea. It seems strange to me that no enemy submarines had joined in the action. Perhaps the engagement was so brief that the submarines had no time to arrive on the scene. It was also puzzling that we had not seen more enemy destroyers. I was startled from these musings by the sight of a great rising of foam and water on our port hand, which had the appearance of a submerging submarine. I called to the sonarman for a target report. The sonar officer replied, "Sir, our acoustic sonar cannot receive effectively while we are steaming like this at 20 knots. I looked back at the queer foam, already far behind, but kept my ship on course. I debated turning back until it was too late to do so. Why could not I act promptly and decisively? I cursed my indecision and the possibly lost opportunity. Warrant Officer Iwata stepped forward, stood miserably at attention, and said, "Commander, it was my fault, sir. I should have spotted the sub before it submerged. Please blame me." Iwata was an expert lookout. His eyes were unbelievably keen. Where other spotters might observe the tiny image of a surfacing submarine at 10,000 meters, Iwata could spot them at distances up to 20,000 meters. But Iwata and the rest of us had been caught off guard. We rejoined the Tanaka flotilla soon afterward, and fueled cruiser Jintsu and the 3 destroyers which were almost bone dry. By 2030 on March 1 the fueling was completed. Jintsu and the 4 destroyers then formed up, 2,500 meters between each ship, in a hunt for enemy submarines. It was a cloudy night with limited visibility, but the sea was calm, and we hoped to discover surface targets. Staring, straining, my crewmen clung to their posts, still bitter and angry from our midday failure. A sub-hunt by our ships, having no radar, was a game calling for great patience. Detection depended on the eyes of the spotters and our none too effective sonar equipment. Our 5 ships zigzagged at 18 knots for 6 hours but made no sightings. The patience of the crew was wearing thin and the spotters were exhausted. In the early morning of March 2, Lookout Magita shouted, "A black object, 40 degrees to port. It appears to be a submarine." Every man on the bridge came suddenly alert. I raised my binoculars but could discern nothing in the darkness. Magita said abjectly, "It now looks like floating debris." This brought a general sigh of disappointment. Through binoculars I could see what looked like a broken native boat. With this letdown, fatigue returned, and for the next hour we had to fight against drowsiness. At 3:40 starboard lookout Bunichi Ikeda cried out, "An unidentified object." bearing 30 degrees. It may be a submarine. All eyes strained in that direction. Something was there. Then Ikeda shouted again, positive submarine. Keen-eyed Iwana, the forward lookout, dejected at being scooped, turned and said, definitely a submarine. Damn. I walked to the tripod on which Ikeda's big 20-centimeter binoculars were mounted, to get a close look. It was unmistakably a submarine, apparently in trouble, some 6,000 meters away. I shouted orders, make no. 2 battle speed 26 knots. Right, 50 degrees. Everybody to battle stations. Gunners ready for action. Ready searchlights. Ready depth charges. The crew, freed from the wearying search game, responded gleefully to the orders. The deck, long still and quiet, was now a beehive of activity. The ship quickly picked up speed. An orderly ran from astern with the message that destroyer Hitsukaze was following us. All right. Tell the signalman to light up the blue tail lamp showing 26 knot speed, I replied. Hitsukaze may want to cooperate. Iwana shouted, surfacing submarine now distant 3,500 meters. Lieutenant Aquino hollered from his fire control post, Commander, guns ready to open fire, sir. We will fire when target is at 2,500 meters, 60 degrees to starboard. The enemy submarine appeared to be adrift. Our 612.7 centimeters. Guns and the 90 centimeters. Searchlight were rotated to the 60-degree angle.